Alright, so hey everyone, today I want to take a look at the Doom 1 and 2 re-release. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X. This re-release basically replaces the Unity ports that came out in 2019. As a quick summary of this video, the issues I'm going to cover are basically the same exact issues that were present in the Quake 1 and 2 remasters. So those include angular restriction of the movement dead zone, as well as the camera, and the camera specifically the angular restriction scaling with the dead zone size, as well as the curve also scaling with the dead zone size. So those are present here. So if you've already seen those, this will be a little redundant, but there are some differences that I'll cover right now. So for movement, here by default the option is 24% for the movement dead zone, but we can see it's actually about 40%, and this is no longer a circular dead zone like what was in the Quake remaster. It's now a sort of squarish clover shape, and you'll notice that there are two thresholds. The larger threshold is for when you're walking. I have always run off disabled right now, but and the smaller threshold is for running. So if I try to get in right in between these, you can see that I'm not moving right now because I'm walking, but if I start sprinting, you can see that I start moving. So the running dead zone is smaller than the walking dead zone, and if you have always run enabled, it'll use the smaller of these two dead zones being drawn anyway. So showing the diagonal movement a little tricky with the shape, so I'm going to run up against this wall, and you can see I am moving perfectly forward, but since I'm not looking perfectly at it, I'm drifting very slightly. But diagonal movement begins pretty abruptly, so you should see this threshold pretty clearly. And you can see that with fuller stick tilt movements, you have a sort of bell shape, but then it moves into this sort of curved neck shape. And the larger restriction is for walking, and the smaller restriction is for running. So to try to get in the middle of this, you can see that I'm moving perfectly forward. Walking right now, if I start sprinting, you can see that I'm moving. So diagonal movement starts a little sooner when you're running. Trying to look at the horizontal, the vertical axis restriction. You can see, try to do the same thing here. See that movement begins pretty abruptly, so that you can see this threshold a little more clearly. This around the vertical threshold, this is a different shape than what I drew for the Quake remasters. For them, I tested the around the horizontal axis for the forward and back restriction. And normally I assume symmetry, so I might have to go back and see if those restriction actually match this, because I could have been wrong and just assumed symmetry where there wasn't some around the vertical axis. For the difference in this sprint and walk dead zone, it seems that the difference in this dead zone is, you move when you're sprinting, but it seems to be biased horizontally. You can see that there's restricted movement within this range. So the difference seems to tend to lean towards moving horizontally. But for the camera, by default, we have a 27% option dead zone, and that's conveyed here. I think the actual default is 26.5%, but once you change the in-game slider, it changes to 27%. You don't have decimal increments to move in. But while there's no diagonal movement for the camera, we do have, we can see that the axis restriction is the same as it was in the Quake Remasters, and it's still unscaled here, so that once you break out of this range, you can see how abrupt movement begins. So this was a significant issue in those Quake titles, but here it doesn't matter at all because you're just going to be moving the stick left and right, and you'll never really interact with this axis restriction here. But there is a jump in acceleration after the shaded region, so it might be a little difficult to see. There's some build-up time for it, so seeing the initial jump might be a little less clear, but falling off of it I think is a little more clear. So it's accelerated, unaccelerated, accelerated, and unaccelerated. Since the curve changes with the Deadzone size, we'll cover that. So by 27%, this is sort of a shallow S-curve. So it starts a little slower than normal, but then builds up a little faster than normal, and then begins to taper off. And there's a slight jump in acceleration, and then it increases slightly till its maximum. So looking at the maximum dead zones, we have 50%. And for movement, this again is wrong. So it's about 68% or about 65% for the smaller horizontal dead zones when running. And I'm going to skip showing the restriction just for time, but it is a similar shape as at the default dead zone. But the camera is at 50% exactly, so this is correct and still perfectly radial. But you can see that the axis restriction has increased because it scales with the dead zone size, and movement here begins, much more abrupt because being unscaled, this axis restriction is just eating any of these smaller subtle values. So again, not an issue in this game because you're just moving left and right, but that was a significant issue for Quake titles. But the restriction has, the acceleration jump has been pushed out because this also scales with the dead zone size. So the larger the dead zone, the more this acceleration jump is pushed out. And since the curve also scales with the dead zone size, we can see that the curve at 50% is actually much more like an exponential curve. So it starts pretty slow and then builds up gradually until it's this acceleration jump, and then builds up slightly more just after it. So movement again is a little wrong, so instead of 5% it's around 10%. And it's a little difficult to tell, but this is sort of the most squarish this type of dead zone becomes. And you can see the restriction has changed pretty dramatically. That little sort of bell shape has kind of been stretched to become a large wedge, and I'll try to demonstrate that here. This is, if I can get these fast movements are the curve issue I'll cover in just a second. But that's good enough. So we can still see that when we break into this region, the diagonal movement is pretty dramatic. And then there is a sharp end where it begins tapering into thinner neck for this. And the vertical, or the restriction around the vertical axis is about the same at any dead zone size, but except for the initial portion where it swoops back into the dead zone. For the camera, we have a 5% circular dead zone, so still accurate to the option. The angular restriction, again, not mattering much, but we can see here is very slow compared to 27% and especially 50%, and that's because while being unscaled, you're still losing a bit. It's not losing as much of those subtle values just around the axis. But since the acceleration jump scales with the dead zone size, this occurs very early. And the curve itself is almost a root curve. It builds up very fast and then begins tapering off, and then it's this acceleration jump, and then still tapers off until its maximum turn rate. So if we overlay the curves ignoring the dead zones, we can see that the curve changes dramatically based on the dead zone size, and the smaller the dead zone, the faster the acceleration begins. So the acceleration curve at 5% is many times, or starts many times faster than at 27% and especially 50%. This is a huge issue and makes it dead zone options almost worthless, at least to lower, because while dead zones are supposed to help with precision and making controls feel more responsive, lowering the dead zone here almost destroys your precision, because lowering the dead zone ends up making your initial acceleration much faster than at any larger dead zone size. It's just completely counterproductive. This curve range isn't quite as bad as it was in Quake. In Quake, you could mitigate that. There was a curve exponent there that lets you affect the curve, and raising that did mitigate the issues in Quake. That option is not available here, but they could have probably just set a larger value, and that would have explained this slightly less bad version being applied here, but it's still a very significant issue and not pleasant at all. Looking at smoothing and acceleration, if we enable this, smoothing is applied. So, and this is pretty obvious. Like if I change directions, you can see that there's a slight lull before it builds up to its maximum turn speed. And I had thought that this max turn acceleration function controlled the acceleration jump like in the Quake Remasters. It doesn't. It is actually a smoothing intensity option, basically. This controls how long it takes to build up. So at 0, this doesn't mean that smoothing doesn't function. It means that it's sort of the most heavy. And the default's, I think, like 15. But if we look at the opposite, we can see that there's no lull, so either smoothing's disabled at this, or it's just very low. And of course, if we disable that, then smoothing's disabled. So there's no issue. Like normally I don't like smoothing, but there's an option, and this additional max turn acceleration option gives you more granularity. So that's great. So no issue with that. But like I'd really like to request that these issues be addressed. So improvements like, say, the movement dead zone should match the option dead zone size. So if you set it to 24%, it should be 24%, not 40%. It should be perfectly circular. And the angular restriction for both the movement and the camera, while the camera doesn't matter, should be removed because there's no need to restrict diagonal movement, and especially if it's not scaled, you're just losing those subtle angles. For the curve should not scale with the dead zone at all. The curve that we had for the default 27% dead zone was fine. Really, many different curves work fine, but that curve that we had at the default dead zone would be fine if we had it for 50% dead zone and for a 5% dead zone. It's just that losing or making the curve unnecessarily sensitive by lowering the dead zone is the issue. Getting curve options would be great, and there was curve option in the Quake Remaster, but just getting a usable curve is really all that would fix this, but options are always good. Unfortunately, these issues were present, have been present since the first update for the first Quake Remaster, and they weren't addressed there. They weren't addressed in the Quake 2 Remaster, and now they're present here. And ideally, it'll be fixed here, but unfortunately it seems like it's almost a preset at this point, and if it isn't addressed here, it's probably going to make it into their following games, which ideally wouldn't happen. Hopefully, I really hope that we can see improvements to this where this is addressed, and then each of their following games are free of this. Because while I didn't test it here, the curve I think still applies. I tested it in the Quake 2 re-release. The movement curve also scales with the dead zone, so it becomes more sensitive. You don't need that much precision for movement, but ideally that would be a fix too. But yeah, and specifically comparing it to the previous Unity ports that this overall replaces. The Unity ports didn't have dead zone options, they didn't have button configuration, but as far as the movement dead zone, the dead zones there were used 20% radial dead zones for both sticks, and a slight, I think like 2% axial dead zone, which caused restriction all across the axis, but especially right around the dead zone. But that restriction there for the movement was quite a bit less than what we have here. So this is actually a step back for the movement dead zone. It's more restricted in this version. And while, again, dead zone options are a addition compared to the Unity port, because of this acceleration curve issue, it's really not a benefit, or not much of a benefit anyway, over the Unity port, because lowering the dead zone is generally counterproductive. So, and it's a huge shame, as I've mentioned in the Quake titles. These ports are excellent in every other way. So we have controller bindings now. We have tons of display options. These ports are excellent all throughout, except with the exception of the thumbstick controls. And there's a very real opportunity for them to address it. And if they do, these are about as perfect of ports as anyone could ask for. It's just these stick controls are just really holding it back from being perfect. So that really covers things. Just ideally making the movement dead zones radial, matching the dead zone size option, removing the restriction, and making the curves not scale with the dead zone size. That would fix everything, and ideally, hopefully, we'll be able to see that. But that about covers things, so thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.